Good afternoon, and welcome to the National Archives. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the William G. McGowan Theater this afternoon, and a special welcome to those joining us on YouTube. Alondra Nelson will discuss her book, The Social Life of DNA, Race, Reparations, and Reconciliation after the Genome, with moderator Alelia Bundles. But before we get to that, I'd like to tell you about a couple of upcoming programs. Tomorrow at noon, we'll welcome back historian Ira Berlin, who will discuss his latest book, The Long Emancipation, The Demise of Slavery in the United States. He offers a framework for understanding slavery's demise in the United States, and a book signing will follow the program. And on Thursday at 7, a bipartisan group of former members of Congress, along with other issue experts, will discuss the evolution of campaign financing and share their personal experiences running for public office and raising money. The panel will also discuss the First Amendment right to free speech and how it has recently been interpreted in connection with campaign financing. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibitions, consult our monthly calendar of events. There are copies in the lobby, as well as sign-up sheets where you can receive it by regular mail or email. You'll also find brochures about other National Archives events. Another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our work in education and outreach, and there are applications for membership also in the lobby. And a little secret that I keep telling everyone, no one has ever been turned down for membership in the National Archives Foundation. Many researchers come to the National Archives to conduct genealogical research. We have numerous records available. They include military records as well as muster rolls, personnel files, pension files, records of the Freedmen's Bureau and Freedmen's Bank, and census records. And with the advancements in science, we can use our DNA as part of that research. Isabel Wilkerson, author of The Warmth of Other Suns, said, "One of this generation's most gifted scholars examines the unfolding mysteries of DNA sequencing and the limits and promises of genetic genealogy at the intersection of race, politics, and identity." Randall Kennedy, a professor at Harvard Law School and author of The Persistence of the Color Line, calls this new book remarkable. The author, he says, explains the ways in which genomic research is being deployed by people, particularly Black Americans, to explore their genealogical history. Patricia Williams, a Columbia Law professor and columnist for The Nation, says the book is a brilliant ethnography of recreational uses of DNA. She adds, it has emerged as the symbolic grounding for magical cures, heritage tourism, escapist fantasy, as well as legal actions for ethnic and racial reconciliations, reparations, and repatriation. Alondra Nelson is Dean of Social Science at Columbia University in New York and currently chair-elect of the Science, Knowledge, and Technology section of the American Sociological Association. She wrote the award-winning Body and Soul, The Black Panther Party, and the Fight Against Medical Discrimination. She's the co-editor of Genetics and the Unsettled Past, The Collision of DNA, Race and History, and Technicolor, Race, Technology, and Everyday Life. With her as moderator and is author and journalist Alelia Bundles, who just happens to be the chair and president of the Foundation, National Archives Foundation. She is working hard at work on her fourth book, which I can't wait to be able to celebrate here on the stage, The Joy Goddess of Harlem, Alelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance. It's a biography of her great-great-grandmother, whose parties, friendships, international travels, and arts patronage helped define the era. Please join me in welcoming Alondra Nelson and Alelia Bundles.
Oh, that's pretty good. Good afternoon. Hello, National Archives Foundation. Thank you all for coming out. It was just rain, so thank you for not being intimidated by a little bit of threat of snow in DC. And welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater in the National Archives in the District of Columbia. Many thanks to David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and to NARA's Programming and Education Committee, who put together such a great array of programs. I could be here almost every day this month. For Alondra and tomorrow for Ira Berlin. So for those of you who are watching on television or who are here, you can go to nara.gov or archivesfoundation.org to look at the schedule. So Alondra Nelson, welcome.
Well, thank you, Lilia.
So it's just good to see you. So
Nice to
Alondra and
see
I are
you.
friends. We have
Yes.
a Columbia connection, and so it's just really fun for me to be able to talk to you about your new book. And once I started reading the book, it seems like DNA stories were everywhere. There was an article in the Washington Post last week about a trumpet that had been found in the wreckage of the USS Houston, I think. And so now it's being examined for DNA to see if they can identify who the trumpet player was. And then I was at Columbia yesterday and talking with the class, and there's a woman in the class who has a Chinese daughter who's adopted, and they've done DNA testing trying to connect her to her biological family.
Yes.
So it's everywhere, and we're fascinated
It's
by things like
everywhere.
CSI, and we don't want to admit that we watch Maury Povich and paternity tests, but that's sort of the way that we have an entry. But how did you get interested in this topic?
So I got interested, I think there's probably two stories. One starts 4 decades ago as a child when it became clear that I was what social scientists call the ken keeper. So before the genetic testing age, the ken keeper was the person in the family who you could call and knew all the information about everybody else in the family. So there's typically one person you can call and can tell you who got married, who's pregnant, who's going to have a baby, who's moving, and all of that, right? In the DNA age, that person is also often the genealogist, the person who is holding the records, the person who's looking for the records, and the person increasingly who is involved in DNA testing and the analysis of one's test results. So as a little girl, I think I was the ken keeper. I was the oldest of 4, am the oldest of 4, and I would try to stay at the table when we had relatives visiting as long as I possibly could. I remember, I had my grandmother's brother, my Uncle Tommy, was this grand orator and had one of these gorgeous kind of mid-century, 20th century voices, and he was a truck driver, and he would come and visit, and I would try to stay at the table as long as my parents would let me to hear those sorts of stories. And then, skip ahead a few decades, in 2002, 2003, there started to be press accounts of genetic ancestry testing starting in the United States. And there were press accounts about it being able to be used to trace the roots of African Americans, which had been, a centuries-long sort of search for many in our community. And so I was really intrigued by that, and that's really where I got started. And I'll show, I brought just a few photographs actually from the field work. Let me see if I can get these up. So when I started doing the research, you didn't have genetic ancestry testing shows, documentaries, reality television shows, and to find the early adopters of genetic ancestry testing, you had to go to conventional genealogy societies, genealogical and biographical historical associations and societies. And so that's what I started doing in 2003. And I also became a member of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, both the national chapter and my local chapter in Harlem. And so this is a photograph from a national meeting in the aughts that took place in Massachusetts. There's a genealogist dressed here in period costume, colonial period costume, as genealogists sometimes do. And he's with a young geneticist who teaches at the University of Massachusetts named Jamie Lowell. And this was a moment, I think this was sort of 2006, 2007, where you're starting to see a transformation in genealogy where people are, conventional genealogists are really taking up genetics as part of the work that they do. And so this is from that same meeting, and you probably wouldn't have these so much now at genealogy conventions and meetings, but you had often DNA 101 sort of sessions for genealogists. And so this is a DNA 101 session, and they're holding up the sort of nitrogen bases that make up the nucleotides that make up DNA. They're learning how the double helix comes to take shape. And there's a genealogist here holding a double helix as part of this same session. So that was really how I got started, and I made a kind of transition as the field made a transition from conventional genealogy to the real emergence of genetic genealogy as a practice.
So here at the archives, we're at ground zero for genealogy.
Yes.
So after Alex Haley wrote Roots and the movie was on in 1977, I think a lot of people here take great pride in knowing that the late James Walker, who was on the staff here, was one of the people who helped Haley. But then there was just this boom where people were waiting in line to look at microfilm. What is it that makes us want to know about these ancestral links?
I think offer two answers. I mean, one is that Roots was phenomenal storytelling. And so I think that, as I say in the book, Roots provided a yearning, but it didn't provide a process or a process that everyone could follow. So it provided the expectation that one could, if one wanted to, trace their ancestry. And Haley talks a lot about how difficult it was, but I think people didn't quite take that in. And so you would find people at the archives, and there were some people who had more time and more energy to do this work. So that's part of it. I think that everyone wanted to be able to tell such a rich story about their family. And secondly, I think we are a community of people who've settled from other places. And so that means that you don't actually always have oral history or the family history you might want. Those records might be in County Cork in Ireland. They might be in small counties and somewhere in the United States that you don't have access to, or they might not exist if we're talking about the descendants of slaves. So you might have records that were destroyed during the Civil War, slave manifest records that might exist in the Netherlands or in England, but are maybe not accessible here, or take some doing to get access to. And so, the great thing about the New World is that people come here to start anew, some coming as voluntarily, some people came shackled, as my slave descendants did. But people start anew, but there still then, I think, is a yearning for the stories of the old country and of our origins.
So when people describe this process of doing the test and discovering what tribe or what region they're from, it can be a very spiritual kind of revelation for them. But you have been both a participant and a scholarly observer of this. So what was your experience like?
I come to the project as a skeptic. So, when I learned in 2002, 2003 that these companies, some of the early companies, Family Tree DNA, African Ancestry, are starting in the United States, I think, I was always interested about my family genealogy, but I had considered myself an African American and wasn't so curious about those particular roots. I just took it as a given. And so I was curious, are there people who really want to know this? And to what lengths will they go to know this? And because, among other things, I'm a sociologist of science and also a historian of African America, I was also interested in why people, communities who might be averse to using genetic technologies in their lives, given the history of the way the intersections of science and race and how it could be oppressive, particularly for vulnerable communities, the poor, communities of color, sometimes women, why they would be willing to take that leap. And so I started just following these people around and listening to their stories. And as skeptical as I was going into the project, and still remain, particularly around the technology in some regard, I couldn't help but take in the stories of people, the accounts of people who had said their whole lives they've always wanted to know. And it's often the case that in settings where I'm speaking about this work, about what African American root seekers say, that there are often adoptees in the audience that say, I feel the same way. So that there are, I now take to heart that there are people who have felt I use the word genealogical disorientation, who have felt disoriented in the world and are seeking a certain kind of mooring in the world that genealogy can provide. And I started also doing my genealogy more intensively. So, I started being the person at the microfiche or the microform machine early in the morning. I was looking at vital records and these things on Ancestry.com and using other kinds of resources. And so I did get very much in touch with that. And that kind of genealogy still remains more appealing to me in some regard. But I became both a participant observer and a sort of bird's eye scholar of the phenomenon.
So I have some other questions along that line, but I don't want to stop you from
I just
showing
have a few.
slides that you want to do.
Let's see here. Am I doing the right way? Am I going the wrong way? Oh, what did I do? So this is part of my research. Often took me to Salt Lake City. I went to a meeting of Black genealogists in Salt Lake City. We went to the Mormon Genealogy Library and spent a few days there. And this is the interior of there's a Mormon temple in Harlem on the corner of 128th and Malcolm X Boulevard or Lenox Boulevard, yes. And this is the interior. This is a woman named Sharon Wilkins, who was the president for a time of the AUGS, Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society chapter that I joined. And for a few years, I don't know if they're still having them, this Mormon temple had Black History Month events. And the conceit of these events, or the sort of slogan that brought us here was you don't know where you're going until you know from whence you've come. And so that's, obviously very key to Mormon cosmology, this idea of finding one's family in a genealogical sense. And it's also important to many African Americans. That's a phrase that you hear African Americans saying. So my research took me there as well. Let's see if I can get that. And that's Venture.
Yes.
I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Absolutely. Because that goes to the science and the emotion.
Yes, yes. So this is a cover of the slave narrative of a man named Venture Smith, who was enslaved in Connecticut and bought his freedom and the freedom of members of his family by doing additional labor after the labor he would do in the day-to-day. And he was an interesting, self-made man, quite an American story. He died, he was quite wealthy by the time he died as a free man. And his slave narrative is unique among slave narratives, in part because he talks about the Middle Passage journey. So he tells us who his parents were, the village that he lived in. He talks about the journey across the Atlantic. He knows the name of Collingswood, this notorious sailor, was the captain of the ship. So he gives us a lot of detail about his life. And I begin with his story because in the mid-aughts, in about 2007 or 8, there is an endeavor by historians, geneticists, archaeologists to exhume his grave and to do genetic testing on his remains. And so it becomes a kind of paradox for me about the social power of DNA and again, about the social life of DNA, and that we know more about his life than we could hope to know about any life, practically. Even historical figures, important historical figures, presidents, senators, from the founding of the colony and of the United States. And yet we still there was still a desire to find out what the genetic evidence told us, even though he told us the full story. And so I kind of, part of the paradox I begin the book with is, why is it the case that we know all that we could possibly know from his own words, in fact, accounting for the person he translated his story with and for that filter of the person who would help him tell the story. And so why still then do we need to do genetic ancestry testing to find his African origins when he told us what they were? And so, I use a few, the book is really an endeavor, I think, in part to answer that question. And one of the answers very early comes from members of his family who know each other and who have very deep genealogy about their relationships to each other. And one of his 8th generation descendants says that she hopes it will help American school children. Another of them says that she hopes it will bring healing. And it's this healing piece that I try to highlight in the book. I think that we're seeking knowledge about our origins, but that there's also something that we hope genetic analysis, genetic ancestry testing can do to shine a light on the past and on the past of racial slavery and help us to really reconcile what that means for all of us.
So there's that emotion, there's that desire to have this link to prove something. But the science is really relatively new. Talk to us a little bit about this Human Genome Project and big data and how those things have made it possible to look at this.
So part of what's been interesting about and wonderfully compelling about the project has been spending time with genealogists over the course of a decade or so as the technology was changing. And part of what's been fascinating has been just watching the technology change. So I write in the book about the late 90s in which we are using genetic ancestry testing or genetic analysis, to look at what are considered ancient remains. And so a case of this is the African Burial Ground Project in Lower Manhattan, where techniques were developed, to use a reference database of contemporary African DNA, and we can really unpack what that might mean, and to get some of the samples of the people who were buried there and sequence and amplify them and try to get information. And this was in really early days of the technology, and they weren't able to do it for really more than about a dozen people. And today it would be much easier. The DNA segments were too short. The technology wasn't as good as it could be. But it sort of opened up the possibility of doing this work. And so since then, and this was when the Human Genome Project was just beginning, which is this scientific feat that really married supercomputing and sort of bigger computing power, increased computing power to analyze the full genome of actually it was a sort of subset of about half a dozen people, and to sort of say what are the sort of building blocks that we all share as a human community, as a human group. But because of these advanced computing techniques, what it also allowed us to do was not only to more deeply understand the 99.9%, that way that we're alike, but also to be better at parsing the 0.1%, right, which is where a lot of human diversity and variation is said to lie, according to genetic scientists. And so it's been interesting to follow the refinement of that technology. And that technology was, very soon, that the ability to parse that 0.1% was very soon taken up by direct-to-consumer genetic ancestry testing companies. And, even that field has continued to evolve.
Yeah, well, so that's what everybody, wants to swab their cheek or spit into the tube and find out what the connection is. I did a National Geographic one years ago, and that was sort of, to me, just more confusing than anything else. And then I recently did Ancestry DNA, and it was kind of like, really, it didn't answer any questions. But what is it which ones are the best? That's really what people want to know.
So, I think you're not going to get a satisfying answer for me as a scholar for which one is best. I write about the tests, not about their technical, matrilineage test and patrilineage test and autosomal test, although I do some of that in the book. I'm interested in the tests and the way that they provide they answer the questions or respond to the desires that people bring to them, right? And so the tests do very different technical things, but if you want a test that gives you a nation state or that gives you a deep ancestry, which might be like your National Geographic test, a haplotype group that can go pretty far back in time, you're gonna go to a company that offers you the kind of information that you want. And so some people want an inference, a guesstimate about a particular nation state that might not give you a lot about time, but it might tell you a place and it'll make some inference about an ethnic group or a tribal group. So that's what some people are seeking. Other people want an approach that allows them to think about different types of information using autosomal DNA. And so the best test, I think, is the test that answers the question that you have that you're trying to answer. And I think that there are things that people might say about the technical limitations of various tests, which I think are true and which we can talk about. But I think my perspective is a more of a bird's eye view of the industry, and that there are just limitations to what the technology can tell us. I mean, until we honestly reach a place where you can sort of grid sample the entire globe and get DNA from all over the globe, I think it will be very difficult to make very sort of robust inferences about people's ancestry.
Right, so when you found out, when you did your reveal.
Yeah, so I did my reveal. One of the things I've been fascinated with, because I've traveled with genetic genealogists for so long, is that the reveal becomes a thing just a few years ago. So when I was going to these genealogy conventions and these sorts of things, people would say, oh yes, I got my results. And because these were genealogical communities, they might be carrying their results, markers or certificate in an envelope or in a kind of plastic sleeve, but none of them had really engaged in reveals. And then you have, starting in the UK really in the early aughts, and then by the time you get to 06, 07, 08 in the United States, a kind of an explosion of a cottage industry of genetic genealogy television shows, reality television shows. And the television shows often feature actors, and actors are great performers. And so there are these evocative reveals in which people are deeply and highly emotional, and they're emotional to us. I mean, I've watched Who do you think you are? And I've cried. I've watched, the one of many Skip Gates genetic ancestry testing shows, and I've cried watching these as well. They can be very emotional. And so what I've found is that means that your non-celebrity genealogists that I spent time with were looking for a way to have their own reveal. And so I write a bit in the book about the emergence of a subset of YouTube videos in which people videotape their entire experience. They videotape themselves swabbing their cheeks. They videotape themselves waiting for the result. Someone brings it to them in the mail. Sometimes they're confessional moments where people are just talking about how they feel as they're waiting for the test results. And then lo and behold, the test result comes and they open it on camera on this YouTube video and do their own reveal. So the reveal, having an audience, and of course, because YouTube is a social media experience, you not only have an audience that's watching, you have an audience that will write back to you about that experience. So I think that's a way that sort of non-celebrity consumers have tried to incorporate the emotion of the reveal in their experience. And then for myself, when I started doing my research, I was studying genealogists. I wasn't studying a particular company or a particular test. And so I was interested in the variety of tests and companies that different people were using. So at this time, people were using family tree DNA. Some of my research was before 23andMe existed, but that would become important. The African Ancestry Company. There used to be a company called Ancestry by DNA that no longer exists, Trace Genomics, which no longer exists. So there was lots of companies have sort of come and gone. And so then it became clear that a lot of the people were using the African Ancestry Company. And so, and as I can say later, that the African Ancestry test was becoming involved in reparations politics, was becoming involved in diaspora and kind of a new citizenship politics that I was following. And so the book really narrows in on that company, but the research really is about the experience of genealogists who used often many, many different companies. So for my own case, I'd been talking, the thing that's different, my first book was a historical book. And this new book was about something that was happening and evolving as I was doing the research. And so I found myself in a different situation in that I was being asked to give talks about the research as it was ongoing. And in Q&As, inevitably, one of the questions, whether it was a more scholarly audience or a more sort of public audience, was, have you taken one of these tests? And so, as I said, I had been skeptical. I felt very comfortable in my Africanness without having to have any kind of, a haplotype group finding or, an ethnic group or tribal finding that would sort of tell me for sure. But it became clear in my research that as a sociologist, as an ethnographer, that a bit of my credibility as a researcher was on the line, and that people were asking, when they asked, had you taken the test, they were asking, can we trust what you say? Have you had the experience? And have you worked through the experience? So for a little while I said, well, no, but I've been doing genealogy now for 5, 6, 7 years, doing paper trail genealogy, and that wasn't quite cutting it for the folks that I was talking to. So in 2008, I decided I was going to go, one of the stories that I follow is an organization called the Leon Sullivan Foundation. Leon Sullivan was a civil rights era preacher. He was a little bit older than Reverend King in Philadelphia, a Baptist preacher, and he is known, he's still taught in business curriculums, his Sullivan principles, which were these ethical principles by which multinational corporations could do business in South Africa during the apartheid regime. He was on the board of GM. He's a pretty interesting, now deceased historical figure. And one of the things that he talks about and writes about was having a kind of messianic vision to bring together Africans on the African continent and Africans in the diaspora, particularly African Americans. And the way that he did this was through kind of various social projects and economic and development projects, and he was a man also who held passports to several countries on the African continent. So his organization starts what are called Leon Sullivan Summits, and they are convenings of mostly African American elites on the African continent, and they often included people like Paul Wolfowitz. Condoleezza Rice has attended them. Former President Bill Clinton was on the chairman of the board of this organization for a while, was the honorary chairman of the board. Andrew Young, who I write about in the book. And so at one of these summits in 2008, they passed a resolution that encourages people to get genetic ancestry testing, African Americans, and to do social, economic development, philanthropy on the continent of Africa based on the ancestral, tribal, nation-state inference that they receive from the African Ancestry Company. It was a collaboration between these two organizations. And so I was planning to go, the summits were biennial gatherings, and I was planning to go to one in 2010, and it was canceled. But I got something in the mail that said that they were going to have a kind of global Africa policy forum. I have some photographs here I can show you. I can come back to those. Okay, so this is the summit where they first, the website of the summit where they first passed this resolution encouraging the use of genetic ancestry testing. And what's fascinating here is that if, the history of Black arts and letters is really, in part, a history of dealing with the question of diaspora and who we are as African Americans relative to people on the African continent. And much like my experience, it had always just been assumed that we were connected. So W.B. Du Bois ends his life in Ghana, not because he has any evidence that he is Ghanaian, right? But because he feels a kinship and a relationship to Africa. So it didn't matter for so many people for a long time. And so then now you have that sort of bridge or ladder to Africa being built on a double helix in a way that I thought was interesting. I can come back to say a little bit about Isaiah. So this is that occasion. This is the Africa Policy Forum in Atlanta in 2010. In the summer of that month, of that year, I swab my cheek. I do African ancestries testing. It was a co-sponsor of this event. I do one matrilineal test. And this event takes place in September or October. I'm waiting for my test results. And I get an email that's saying, this event is, and I plan to do a public reveal at this event, actually, which is why I signed on to do this. It was on this very stage is where I received my results. And then as I'm waiting to receive news and waiting to go to this event, I get an email from the Leon Sullivan Foundation saying that the reveal has now become a royal reveal ceremony. And it was a royal reveal ceremony because they were going to reveal the genetic ancestry testing results of Martin Luther King III. And so I say, wow, this is getting really interesting. I'm so glad I signed up to do this. But it was also, as my research was culminating at an important moment because it suggested, the way that there have been these attempts to link the civil rights tradition to genetic ancestry testing, that there's something about reconciliation, about Black history is supposed to be deeply tied with genetic ancestry testing. So I was very pleased to get this news because I thought it was going to make, and it did make for a very interesting ethnographic experience for me as a researcher. So I received my reveal. This is Rick Kittles in the dark suit, who is the chief science officer and co-founder of the genetic ancestry company, African Ancestry. And he gave me my results that evening. And he is next to the actor Isaiah Washington, who many of you will know from Grey's Anatomy, lots of Spike Lee movies and other things, who is a genealogist and in 2004 received an ancestry result from African Ancestry. And that's Leon Sullivan pictured in the background on the photograph holding up one of his many African passports. And so on that evening, I got my results. My matrilineal result was inferred to be to the Bamileke people of Cameroon. And I told my parents about this. And my father sort of, looked up from his newspaper and said, oh, that's interesting. And my mother, who's seated here, found it far more interesting and took up a relationship with a woman at her church who is from the Bamileke group in Cameroon. And this family is now part of our family. And they were, as recently as November, they spent Thanksgiving with us, with my family. And they brought roast goat and plantains. And we had that alongside turkey and ham on Thanksgiving. So my reveal was one of these reveals that evening. And then there were the reveals of not only Martin Luther King Jr. III, but Julius Garvey, who is the son of the late Marcus Garvey, pictured here, who's a fascinating fellow. He's a retired cardiac surgeon who lives in the suburbs of New York and Long Island. You can, as I write in the book, he's wearing a lapel pin there that's red, black, and green, so the sort of Pan-African colors on his lapel pin. And then this is Martin Luther King III. also receiving his results. And he's pictured here with Rick Kittles on the far end, Isaiah Washington on the other. The woman in the sort of gold dress is Gina Page, who's the other co-founder of the African Ancestry Company, two King siblings in the middle, and Hope Masters in the black sort of halter dress, who is the daughter of the late Leon Sullivan.
So this, your father's reaction was different from your mother's
Yes.
reaction. And so there are this whole spectrum
Yes.
of reactions, but
Yes.
also the whole spectrum of what people hope to be able to accomplish. With Isaiah Washington, his connection led to philanthropy. There are other people who, the Boston Fleet lawsuit. So there's a whole range.
Yes.
And then the grandmother. So can you connect this range of things that actually prove something
Sure.
to things that are a little murkier?
Speculative, sure. So, I'm a social scientist, and part of what I was trying to do, as I had done several years of the research, is figure out why this all matters, and why people are doing this, and why is this such an important social practice, and why has, there was the Roots happens in 77. It becomes, those of you who are my age or older will remember, it became quite a fad. So you could buy notebooks, and there was all sorts of kind of marketing things that sort of went with the Roots moment. And so the interest in genealogy didn't completely go away, but Roots did have its sort of fad moment. And then here you have genetic ancestry testing that didn't go the way of that earlier kind of Roots mania, hasn't gone the way of the hula hoop or the Rubik's Cube, and is really having a lot of staying power. And so, one of the questions for me becomes, why is this social practice so important, and why now? And so I raised earlier the issue of, or the fact that one of the descendants of Venture Smith said that she hoped the testing would bring healing. And so in the book I use a term called reconciliation projects, and I suggest that what we're trying to do with not only genetic ancestry testing, but genetic analysis more generally, is answer questions, and often answer questions that help us to, as small communities and as national communities, deal with trauma, deal with injury, deal with histories that we don't want to talk about. And I place genetic ancestry testing alongside efforts like the use of genetic analysis after the junta in Argentina that ended in the early 80s by the grandmothers of the May Plaza, or the Las Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, and their work with Mary Claire King, who's a hero of mine, who does what we might call humanitarian genetics, and worked with them very early on, first using blood group typing, and then later, as genetic technology was getting better, genetic analysis to help them find their grandchildren who had been born to children often who were disappeared by this authoritarian state. And so I try to, later, by the time you get to the 90s, this project gets taken up by the Argentinian state as something that they understand that they need to do. So there are ways in which I think nations try to deal with past that they haven't fully aired or reconciled themselves to, and a kind of forensic tool becomes important for that, something that we think tells the truth. So one of these things that we think tells the truth is genetic analysis. Another of these, if we think about the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa and other places, in fact, we had one in Greensboro, South Carolina, not too long ago, where the whole community, following basically a kind of a race riot in which there was a Ku Klux Klan rally, and members of the community were killed, and both black and white. And this community felt like they had never healed decades later from this trauma, and so they start a truth and reconciliation process. And it's the first time, I think, that a truth and reconciliation process starts in a city and not in a nation state. And they start just a series of public conversations and public hearings. And in this case, the forensic tool is not genetics, but is conversation and is people's testimony and is just a community talking and listening with one another. And so I think that genetic ancestry testing kind of falls somewhere in between that, and I try to think of it as a similar kind of social practice of reconciliation. That is about genetic testing telling some truth, actually, maybe, but it's also kind of beyond that as well. I mean, the genetic testing, ancestry testing, I think, becomes an occasion to catalyze a conversation.
Mm-hmm. So, and I have one final question to you about that. So, if anyone wants to start lining up on the sides, we're going to have questions. And I wanted to see if you had other slides
Sure,
before
yeah,
my
let me,
last.
yeah, I just wanted to tell you, one of the, let me see if I can go, I'm going the right way here. Oh, oh no. Okay. I've messed up my
Tom,
slides.
can we get back to the?
Yeah, so I just wanted to show there's a kind of ceremony of remembrance that Isaiah Washington and other people who call themselves DNA Sierra Leoneans participate in. That really gets to the heart of this sort of healing and reconciliation that people are trying to get at. So I'd like to just show you a couple of those photographs before we wrap up.
So Tom, I think we're, if you
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
Tom Nastic, who's just wonderful. Applause for all his hard work. Everything runs smoothly at these programs.
It does. That was very smooth, I must say. I thought we were going to be trying to do this for 10 minutes or something. Thank you, Tom. So this is a photograph that I took for my field work. Just outside of Charleston, South Carolina. It's on the bank of the Ashley River. Getting there was interesting. I flew into Charleston, rented a car and drove out there. And to get to this riverside, you had to go through a kind of late model suburban subdivision. So you go back and you reach this historic site, which is a site of disembarkment for slave ships in South Carolina. We know that from historical records and from oral history that there are the Gullah and Geechee communities in South Carolina that in the Carolina Lowcountry who can trace their ancestry variously through linguistic ties, through foodways, and in some instances through genealogical, through archival records to what we now know as Sierra Leone. And so in the middle of this picture, the sort of three people that are at the center, one is the actor Isaiah Washington, who was there, a member of about a dozen people who called themselves DNA Sierra Leoneans. The woman in the middle is a woman named Tomalin Polite, Polite. The Polite family is interesting because that is a family that does have slave manifest records, and they are the descendants of a little girl named Priscilla, who was brought across the Middle Passage and enslaved in the United States in what is now in South Carolina. And the gentleman in purple is who was an immigrant to the United States from Sierra Leone named Amadou Masali, who was with Washington, the kind of officiant for this, I don't know if you call it ritual, a spiritual, religious ceremony that's called a Sara, S-A-R-A. And it was a ceremony of remembrance for the souls of the ancestors who were lost on the Middle Passage and who had come from Sierra Leone and been lost here in the United States. And that was the occasion that brought them there on that day. This is Amadou Masali. So he had soil with him from Sierra Leone that he threw into the Ashley River to give rest to the souls of ancestors who had been brought across the Middle Passage. This is a gentleman whose name I've forgotten, who identifies I recall he's an actor because he had one of these kind of mellifluous voices, and he is a DNA Sierra Leonean, and they later reef in the water as a way to remember the ancestors that was lost. So that's another way, and that's a more sort of poignant way in which reconciliation is endeavored through the use of genetic ancestry testing.
So there's the healing. I was struck by, this is my final question to you, is that I was really struck by an interview that I heard you do with on radio, and the person who was interviewing you was white who had relatives from Portugal. But he said, I don't have the same wounds that your family has when I look at my past. And your answer to him was about formational wounds and shared wounds. Can you just talk about that as reconciliation?
Sure. I remember that was with the Baltimore Sun. When he first asked the question, I thought, yes, maybe my family or families that are descendant of enslaved people maybe do have different wounds. And then in the course of doing that conversation, of answering him, I sort of took pause and said, but we all do have the same wound, actually, and that same wound. There's one way to talk about it is to say, as the geneticist Mary Claire King says, we're all the same and we're all different, right? And another way to think about it is that the legacy of, if we think about at its best, one of the things that genetic ancestry testing allows is for us to think historically about the present. Then these tests are also a way to show that we are all related and that we're all in it together. And that foundational wound, that wound that is a cornerstone of this nation really exists for all of us. And I think the conversation and the practices around reconciliation attempt in part to really bring that into relief.
That we're all discovering how we're connected, that we
Yes.
really, really are connected.
And your work has done so
Yeah,
much
no,
of
I mean,
this
I
as
found
well.
on Ancestry.com, I've heard from all kinds of people, all
Sure.
kinds of ancestors and people who are related, who I would not have known
Yeah.
about. So.
Yeah.
So questions. We'll start over here because there's one person, then we'll go here and then back.
Thank you very much. Simply outstanding. Thank you.
Thank you.
A few years ago, I did the National Geographic thing. Then I thought, well, it's a few years down the road, things have got to be better. The first one I saw bands coming out of Africa, and it was on the father side and ends up in Germany, and that makes sense because that's what I think is true. So I said, I'll do it again. I do it with Ancestry.com. I get the results back. It's a map of Europe with all these different colors showing me, little 10% here and 20% there. I say, well, this is not very helpful. So I call up the Ancestry.com, and I said, I just was curious about this. I was really happy to see, that I'm a mix of all these different Europeans, but I don't see anything going back before that. And, we know we're all from Africa. And the woman says, we're not all from Africa. I'm from England. And I'm not going to be argumentative, but I just must say that all the research I've seen says that, and it may change. I understand it may change, but the scholarly people are saying that we have to go back to Africa, and I didn't see any Africa here. Well, we're European. And I just said, thank you so much, and I said goodbye. And I just was dumbfounded. Number one, I was dumbfounded. Number two, I'm still looking for a company that can help me.
Yes. So, the companies all do a little something different. And, if you want that kind of deep history, National Geographic is the place to go because that's what they're doing. They're trying to do a kind of deep history, human population, migration map that can help you map those things. And Ancestry.com is using a kind of admixture testing that's more interested in, geneticists will talk about after 1492. So sort of, that's sort of happening during times of empire and colonialism, sort of around that time period. And they're less interested in deep history. They're interested at a moment at which certain mixtures are happening and when these certain European countries that were on your map actually existed in that historical moment.
So go back to National Geographic again?
Well, they're analyzing, different parts of the genome. They're using different techniques and algorithms. And I mean, if you want to go back to your to your African origins, way back, that's probably your best bet.
Geographic. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you for coming.
I think I'm related to that gentleman because I believe we all came from Africa originally, and I first got into that, and I can't remember the author's name, Seven Daughters of Eve.
Brian Sykes.
Yes, thank
Yes.
you. And
Are you an Ursula, a Tatiana? Which?
yes, and then he had the other one, Adam's Curse, which is a little bit different.
Yes.
We can have
I
another
want the
seminar.
Y chromosome. Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, and I'm surprised at how many people don't understand that in this day and age. And one of the reasons I think they don't, and I like your comment on this, is because I don't think race is a viable term to use. Race, I'm an anthropologist, biology, physical anthropology. Mm-hmm. Race is about what shape your nose is, right? What color your eyes are. And that it's a biological thing. And we're not talking about biology thing. We're talking about history. Yes, we're talking about anthropology. Biology is a component of it. So I just think we need to find a new language. Personally, when people ask me, I say, I'm of Indo-European origin or ancestry. And then we have a discussion. So.
Yes. It's good. We need more discussion. So, some colleagues of mine, I will shout out this paper. I've just published a paper in Science in the last week precisely on this question about whether or not we should be using race and what we should use if we shouldn't use race. It's Dorothy Roberts and Michael Udell and Sarah Tishkoff and another co-author whose name I'm forgetting. But I think that as a sociologist and a historian, I would also say, race is not just about noses or skin. Race is about the meaning and the hierarchies that we create out of those symbols, right? Inherently, they mean nothing to us until we create something that says, this means lesser than, this means better than, this means smarter than, this means, And, what's so fascinating to me about the history of race is that the sort of benchmark has been Europeans with other groups being sort of either being lack or excess. Everyone else is just not quite enough or much too much of whatever kind of variable that you're interested in. So this is just to underscore your point. And I think, but we make choices of, consumers of genetic ancestry testing make choices about the various messages that they're sending about race. Because one way is certainly to do a deep ancestry test that gives you lots of information that may or may not map onto something that we're more comfortable calling race today, but that might not be a satisfying answer if you don't know anything about your family past the 19th century, if you're an adoptee, if you're seeking more information, and that might cause people to look for or seek out companies or services that give them something that looks more like a kind of hard and fast ethnic identity or tribal identity.
This is why I love archives events, because we get such smart questions
Yes.
and such smart answers.
From colleagues, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Taboo, Henry Taylor, and I had two questions. One about two things you said. One was racial slavery, and the other one, humanitarian genetics.
Yes, sir.
Racial slavery, I guess I'm familiar with. I know there's been white slavery and there has been black slavery. And I guess the question for that one is, how many races are there? And secondly, on humanitarian genetics, is this a scientific term or a new term? I thought we were all born as animals.
Okay. Let's see what I can do with these, Mr. Taylor. So racial slavery. So I don't accept race as a truism about who we are in the world. I very much think and know that it's socially constructed, but that doesn't mean, as I was saying to my colleague here, that race doesn't have effects in the world, and that we don't, that some don't believe in it, and moreover, that we don't create whole societies and policies that are oriented around thinking about race. So racial slavery suggests that, in some places, right, that slavery was a way of organizing societies and organizing labor that gave definitions to the ways that we look differently, right, and placed them on a sort of hierarchy and aligned those with being the ability to be available to be enslaved and the ability to be available to be free or to be a slave owner. With regards to humanitarian genetics, humanitarianism, I'm thinking about that phrase is not my phrase, but other people have used it as well, but I use it in the book, about humanitarian work, about putting genetics to the use of work that an NGO might do or work that we might do for the betterment of human societies.
Well,
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. My family lore indicates a specific person as our ancestor slave owner and possibly the father of one of my ancestors. What's the best DNA test to use to possibly prove that? And then the other quick question is, how might DNA help with reparations for African Americans?
Okay, so I'm going to punt on the best question because I don't represent any DNA companies. I think that there are caveat emptor. I think there are things that we should be suspect about with the tests with regards to transparency. Is there a gold standard? Are all the companies using the same standards? Are they showing their data to each other? We know in science that good scientific practice means that results can be verified, that they can be, verified by independent parties because the data and the algorithm is shared. And this isn't the case really with any of these companies. With regards to reparations, I write about I might have the finding, the first brief here. I might have pulled that up. Yeah. So I write about this case, Farmer Paleman versus Fleet Boston. So that's the first brief, the first filing in 2002. What happens is very early on in the case, the judge and the defendant say who represented multinational companies still in existence today, whose earlier forms profited from the slave trade. Fleet Boston, Lloyd's of London, CSX, these kinds of companies. And very early on, both the defendants and later the judge in a decision says that the 8 people who are in the plaintiff, it's a class action suit, who are led by Deidre Farmer Paleman, who's a reparations activist, don't have standing. They can't prove legally that they are the parties who have the right to sue for reparations or restitution in this case. And so the court, this case kind of winds in and out of the court for several years. The plaintiffs take the court case back and they enter a narrower case with fewer defendants. And in this narrower case, before introducing this narrower case, they go to African ancestry. I write about a moment that Gina Page tells me about where they show up, Deidre Farmer-Palman, another woman in her office in DC at African ancestry, and say, we want to, and this is in the early days, this is in 2003, so this is, the industry in the United States is a year, maybe 2 years old. And this company is only a year old, African Ancestry, and they purchase genetic ancestry tests that they introduce as evidence. And it was the first time that I could find genetic ancestry testing being introduced as evidence in a civil court case. And the court in the end, and I kind of go through the various steps, in the end, initially the court says in the first decision that they can't just merely allege that they are descendants of slaves, and merely alleging is a verbatim term from the decision. And so they introduce in this narrower suit their genetic ancestry test results for African ancestry, which infers some of them to be related to the Gambia, Niger. And the court, again, says that that evidence is not specific enough, and it draws a line between genealogical analysis and genetic analysis. And what the court really is looking for is someone's individual genealogy that can go from, a former enslaved person to, to the person today and all the people in between, and at the same time, a genealogy of capital that can go from, the company that existed in 1842 and its iteration today. And genetic ancestry testing, at least this kind of testing, which uses mitochondrial and Y chromosome DNA analysis, doesn't give any kind of close to that level of specificity. So the reparations story is, if not a failed story, a stalled story for now.
Thank you. Okay.
I wanted to just thank you for taking the time to put all this, in a book.
Thank you very much.
And I had a couple questions, at least one question. I'm a facial plastic surgeon, and my work is at the intersection of self-image, health, and heritage. And one of the things when we talk about identity...
It's fascinating. Louie and I had to just fan ourselves because we thought it was... that's fascinating work, my goodness.
Right, and so when we talk about these ideas around well-being, disfigurement, and identity scarring, I really look at my practice in that context. And so with identity fluidity, now, I've heard you say a number of times that I am a social scientist. And so one of the interesting things about genetics and genomics and DNA is that the social aspects of health has become validated now.
Yes.
And so the question I have for you is that as you look at your own identity as a social scientist, where do you see it evolving, particularly in the context of health and well-being?
Genetics, you're saying?
No, because, health from a perspective of these identity, so the idea of saying I'm a social scientist, that's going to evolve. And I'm wondering how you've internalized or think about your role and your presence, with regards to increasing literacy, because a part of this, the literacy component in genomics and genetic literacy is health literacy.
Yes.
Health relates to sort of social determinants of health.
Yes.
And just from 2010, that's a new marker that has been validated that, hey, all this stuff that happens in society truly does impact in a very meaningful and direct way our health and well-being. So you end up becoming, a 21st century health advocate in a certain sense.
Yes, sure. That's wonderful.
So I'm going to have to limit you to one question.
That was,
We
no,
are
that was
almost
it.
at the end, but that was a great question, so that the young lady behind you can come up after this answer. Thanks.
There's so much there that's rich. So part of the, and the time that I've been studying, so I study sickle cell anemia in my Black Panther books, which is about health disparities and about an earlier way of thinking about the link between biology and wellness and community wellness. And then I come to do this work. But in the course of doing that work from, the late 90s to now, it's also been the case that we've had, new developments in epigenomics and epigenetics that sort of tell us that, that the environment's always acting on the genes, right? So that's sort of a social determinant of health that's sort of deeper and richer and more complex and ecological, I think, than we even had imagined before. I'd also say part of what I'm trying to capture with the idea of the social life of DNA is that genetic analysis and our hopes and our fears about genetics don't just circulate in the CSI forensic criminal justice domain or the health domain or the genealogical domain, that these are happening all together at the same time. And one of the things that came up in my interviews and encounters and engagements with people is that the way that they come to think about a genetic test for breast cancer is informed by their experience with genetic ancestry testing, or one's trust and belief in genetic ancestry testing. I talk about a woman named Pat, is informed by her experience working in a forensic lab in the Midwest in a large city. And so that genetics is, and genetic analysis and DNA, our society is really kind of suffused with it through and through. And so it is the case that if you're working on genetic ancestry testing, whether or not you're working on 23andMe, which we now, their end game is health analysis and pharma, is always about health and well-being. And I would love to talk to you about the work that you do and about sort of wellness as being embodied and how we look, and thinking also about your question about race. I mean, on the one hand, race is a social construction and doesn't matter, but you are literally kind of constructing what faces look like in a way that's just so fascinating. So thank you for beginning that conversation.
Thank you.
We'll see you at the book signing.
Yes,
outside.
exactly. Lily and I were both like, that's so interesting.
All right, our final question, please.
Thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Happy to be here. I wanted to know, what role do you believe genetics will play in Afrofuturism? I'm starting to read a lot more upon that, and I'm like a novice when it comes to like genetic exploration and ancestral history, but I'm wondering how those two intermingle, and also thinking about the study of eugenics and how that's widely affecting people of color. How might the genetic studies that you do, people like you in your field also do, how can that play a role in impacting like the eugenics studies?
Those are two really big questions. So briefly, for those who don't know, in the 90s, I started a project in an online community called Afrofuturism, which is sort of still ongoing. And so I guess one way of answering that is that I think all of my work is still engaged in that conversation. And for me, I mean, there's a lot about, and I've written about musicians and, Sun Ra and LaBelle and people who sort of manifest in this kind of appearance of Afrofuturism. But for me, the kind of meta issue is how the communities that have been the objects of technological, scientific, medical surveillance and experimentation come to imagine themselves as in a technological world, right, and a biotechnical world in this moment. And so to the extent that genetic ancestry testing is a way that communities, lots of communities, but the African Americans that I talked to and spent time with try to reckon with that history and still find themselves able to deal with it. So I write about the African burial ground a bit in the book, and I write about there was a kind of controversy over who should analyze the remains. And as you know, the remains end up for analysis here at Howard University and the Montague Cobb lab. But part of what was interesting there is that you had activists, black activists and community members in New York City saying, we think that you can use craniometry and genetic analysis to analyze these remains, but that it can be done in a way that is more holistic, that takes into account history and culture, that considers whether cowrie shells were buried in the burials, were they facing Africa, were they facing Mecca, were they facing the sun, were families buried together, were men buried separate from women, right? That forms of scientific analysis could be done that could give us information about the experience of African people and colonial New Yorkers that didn't have to be eugenics. And so part of what this moment is trying to capture is in the book is that, while understanding that we exist in a moment where in the forms of technological surveillance used by the criminal justice system, forms of DNA used by the criminal justice system can both exonerate people and can convict them, and something like the Innocence Project, which would be, for Mr. Taylor, I think maybe another form of humanitarian genetics, right? We only need the Innocence Project in a society that over-incarcerates people, right? That's when it becomes, so, the 300 people who've been released, the stories are heartbreaking and beautiful, and we're so glad that they're free. But the precondition of needing the Innocence Project is a society as a carceral society.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I feel smarter after hearing all of this. Let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you very much.
And Dean Nelson will be signing copies of her book upstairs, right outside. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Alelia.